Coming into this season, Lewis Hamilton and George Russell were widely regarded as the best driver lineup on the grid by fans, content creators such as myself, as well as pundits and journalists. Mercedes, along with their drivers, have had an up and down season so far, but despite this, in a recent poll I did asking which team has the best driver lineup, Mercedes still came out emphatically on top, ahead of Red Bull and Ferrari, taking almost 70% of the votes. So how close is the best driver lineup on the grid, and statistically, have they actually been the best? In terms of their head-to-head so far after 14 races, neither has won a Grand Prix yet. Lewis has scored the team's only pole position, which, by the way, I actually got to see for myself whilst I was out at the Hungarian Grand Prix, and I'll just say that the cheer from the fans was literally as if he had won the race. In terms of podiums, it's Lewis who's ahead 4-1. The points tally is also in Lewis's favour, 164-109. Their race head-to-head is 10-4 to Lewis, but the qualifying head-to-head is equal at 7 each, with an average qualifying gap of just over 0.06 of a second in Lewis's favour, and that is damn close. One of the best indications of a strong driver lineup, in my opinion, is the percentage of points that each driver scores compared to the total amount and how close it is between them. In that regard, out of the top 6 teams, Mercedes currently sits third on that list, with Lewis scoring just over 60% and George just under 40%. Alpine actually sits atop of this list, which, to be honest, doesn't really surprise me a huge amount because, although I wouldn't say that Gasly and Ocon are championship caliber drivers, they are both race winners and some of the most reliable point scorers on the grid, driving at a pretty similar level. Unsurprisingly, Aston Martin are by far and away at the bottom of this list, with Alonso absolutely carrying the team. When you take into account that a rookie Oscar Piastri up against a really difficult teammate in Lando Norris has actually contributed more to McLaren than Lance Stroll has to Aston Martin, the team should really have no complaints at the end of the season if they don't finish where their car really deserves. However, stats are not the be-all and end-all when it comes to judging the best lineups on the grid. I think whilst the share of points scored is important, you've also got to consider the actual quality of the drivers, and then lastly the dynamic between the two of them as well. I think the Mercedes driver lineup just ticks all of these boxes because when it comes to Lewis, he still has the speed and consistency to fight for a title, and Russell, to me, whilst he hasn't proven yet that he will be a Rosberg level driver, there is no doubt that he is a much better driver than Valtteri was up against Lewis. The upshot is that the quality and consistency of these two right now is why I think Mercedes are almost semi-comfortably second in the Constructors right now. To be honest, I think Lewis and George, although they do make their mistakes on the odd occasion, which I think is just more of a consequence of the tight battle that we have behind Red Bull, I think looking at the entire season, they have covered over a lot of the mistakes that Mercedes have made. I think there's almost a perception that because of the success that Mercedes had in the hybrid era, that they are still this slick operational machine, but this season I really have seen them make more and more mistakes. Whether it's slow pit stops, strange communication errors which has led to both of their drivers running into each other, or just strategy in general. I don't think Mercedes on an operational level is at the same level as a Red Bull right now. And as I said, I think that both of their drivers have actually done a lot to both paper over and also cover for the team's weaknesses. And now, many people have said online that Mercedes should be second in the Constructors because they've easily had the second best car, but I am not 100% convinced that it should be such a foregone conclusion and basically a certainty because, excluding Red Bull, Aston Martin have definitely had the fastest car for 5 or 6 races this season, and let's be honest, the only reason that they're underperforming as much as they are is entirely down to their driver lineup. McLaren as well from Austria onwards have had 1 or maybe 2 races where you could say that they've perhaps been the fastest car as well, and then Ferrari on tracks like Baku, Canada, Monza, and now Singapore as I'm recording this, they've also had tracks where they've been quickest as well. My point is that although I do think on average across all of the races so far, and even taking into account the bad tracks for each of these teams as well, Yes, Mercedes might have had the second best car on average, but I still think that the 45-point gap that they have back to Ferrari is mostly down to the quality of their driver lineup. If Mercedes still had Hamilton and Bottas, not only would the gap be less than 45 points, but I am not sure they'd even be second right now. Again, I'm not saying that Lewis and George have been perfect, because of course they haven't, but in a season where from race to race, the second fastest car has fluctuated so much, we have seen Hamilton out in Q2 and have bad races, we have seen Russell out in Q1 and have bad races, but taking the entire season into account, considering Lewis is still one of only 3 drivers along with Max and Fernando to score points in every single race this season, to me the drivers at Mercedes have really made the difference in the fight against Ferrari and Aston Martin. Speaking about drivers having bad races, something else that I have found very confusing and almost frustrating when I hear people compare Hamilton and Russell is how their competitiveness is almost used against them. At the beginning of the season, Lewis was criticised when he got out-qualified in 4 out of the opening 5 races. Then during the mid-portion of the season between Monaco and Hungary, Lewis went on a bit of a roll, out-qualifying George in 4 out of the 5 races, and also scoring 3 podiums in that time. And now again, over the last 2 or 3 races, the momentum has once again slightly swung back in favour of George. And now, during this time, I have seen so much criticism of each driver when they've had their own kind of rough patch of 2 or 3 races, and I just don't get it. Some people are shocked when, for example, Lewis, who's achieved so much, isn't dominating Russell from race to race. But then, in the same breath, as shown by the poll earlier, they still think that Mercedes have the strongest driver lineup. That to me just doesn't make any sense, because the reason why this driver lineup is so strong and is regarded by fans as the best on the grid is entirely because they're so close. And so to expect one teammate to dominate the other is almost entirely unrealistic because it contradicts what makes them so strong in the first place. I also think that the competitiveness of the field actually makes their gap look bigger than it sometimes is. As mentioned, on average, Lewis has been just over 600ths of a second quicker, which, although might seem like nothing, in 2023 that can have a huge effect at the sharp end. Take last time out in Monza as an example. Lewis qualified just a 10th behind George, but in the end that put him 4 places behind George, with a Red Bull, Williams and McLaren in between them. That is the nature of the 2023 season, with the margins being so tight and so many teams in the mix. Although the team has been disappointed to not give their drivers better cars, I don't think that they have any disappointment in their driver lineup. Both Lewis and George signed extensions until the end of 2025, which I think means, at least on the driver front, unlike at Red Bull where there is still that uncertainty about the future, not only do they have the best in class in terms of their driver lineup, but there's also no need for speculation, rumours or external pressures surrounding the future of their drivers. I also think that it was a statement of intent to not leave any seats open for 2025. With Lewis, I think they were always chasing a multi-year deal because Lewis is worth a lot more to Mercedes beyond just what he does in the car. But with George, because he still has a lot to prove and also a lot to achieve, they could have given him the Valtteri Bottas treatment to keep him hungry and only give him a 1-year extension. The reason why I think it's so significant is because next year's driver market is going to be absolutely crazy, with every single team on the grid except for Mercedes having at least 1 seat available right now for 2025. By locking both of their drivers for 2025, although the team might be a little bit out of sync in future driver markets, it's given the drivers, team and outside world the message that Mercedes have the best drivers in the world, and they're not even going to open the door for speculation about anyone else. I think the driver lineups of Mercedes and Ferrari, both of which by the way in my opinion are very, very close to each other, is exactly why Red Bull are still unsure about Checo's future. Yes, they have the comfort of a massive car advantage now, but at Mercedes and Ferrari I think you genuinely have 4 drivers who on their day can each challenge for a title. I think that the very fact that Red Bull are lining up replacements and planning for the future now, despite the dominance and success of their season, is probably the biggest testament to how strong they see the Mercedes driver lineup being, and how much of an issue that can give them when they do catch up. Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video and want to support the channel, then don't forget to subscribe, that would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.